At midnight, the Charleston mansion wrote its own history. Names appeared on the walls in fresh blood. And every person whose name was written never survived to see the morning. The year was 1852, and the land stretched wide under a sun that showed no mercy. From the swamps of Louisiana to the endless fields of cotton, the air was heavy with heat and something darker, an unspoken weight pressing down on every soul who lived beneath the whip. On one of these plantations, hidden from the eyes of justice, lived men and women whose names were written nowhere, whose lives were counted only in labor and lashes. They bent their backs from dawn till dusk, picking cotton, cutting cane, hauling wood, while their masters grew rich on the sweat of stolen lives. Among them was Solomon. His skin bore scars older than his memories, lines carved by lashes that never truly healed. His hands were calloused, rough as bark, his eyes deep wells of silence. Solomon was not a man of many words. His language was the rhythm of work, the bow of his back, the clenching of his fists when anger rose but could not be spoken. The overseer called him ox, not out of respect but as mockery for his strength. Day after day Solomon lifted loads that broke other men. He endured heat that made even the whip-wielders retreat into shade. And yet, for all his power, he lived with the knowledge that he was powerless. His strength was theirs to command, his life theirs to measure, his body theirs to break. But in the quiet of his silence, a storm was gathering. Nights on the plantation were no kinder than the days. When the sun dropped and the work ended, the slaves were herded into wooden shacks, small boxes with no air and no comfort. Families huddled together, whispering prayers in the dark, holding on to one another like driftwood in an endless sea. Some sang soft, broken hymns of deliverance. Some cried quietly into the night. And some, like Solomon, stared into the black, eyes open, mind awake, waiting. Every night he listened to the sounds, the heavy boots of the overseer making rounds, the whip coiled at his belt, the drunken laughter spilling from the big house, where masters feasted on food they had not earned, the coughs and groans of the sick in the cabins, left to die with no care. And sometimes, screams. The screams of women dragged from their huts, their children clinging to their skirts until they were kicked aside. Screams swallowed by the night, answered only by the rustling of trees. It was a sound Solomon hated most, a sound that dug into him deeper than the whip. His fists would curl tight, nails cutting into his palms, but he could do nothing. Nothing yet. The master of this land was Jeremiah Aldrich. His wealth was vast, his cruelty vaster still. Aldrich was a man who took pride not only in what he owned, but in how much he could break. To him, slaves were not human. They were tools, property, flesh to be bent until it shattered. He had a taste for humiliation, a hunger for watching dignity stripped bare. There was one woman he singled out often, Celeste the cook. Her meals fed his household, her back bore his anger. To him she was not Celeste, not mother, not wife, just another possession. And yet, even in her suffering, she carried herself with a dignity that defied him. It was this defiance that drove Aldrich to a decision one evening. Surrounded by his drinking companions, flushed with whiskey and arrogance, he boasted of his power. He bragged that he could make any of his slaves do anything he desired, no matter how grotesque. To prove it, he signed his name to a paper that would later rest in the Louisiana archives. A marriage certificate binding him to Celeste, listed beneath his signature not as a bride but as property. The paper was not love. It was not union. It was mockery, degradation pressed into ink. To Aldrich it was a bet won, a game played at the expense of a woman's soul. To Celeste it was a chain heavier than any iron shackle. And to Solomon, it was the final insult, the last lash that split open a wound too deep to close. In the weeks that followed, Solomon's silence deepened. To those around him, he was the same, stoic, immovable, a man who carried more weight than any beast of burden. But inside something had shifted. He began to watch more carefully, the changing of guard shifts, the way the overseer grew drunk by sundown, the hidden cracks in the routines of power. At night, when others slept, Solomon sat awake, carving into the dirt with a stick, drawing lines only he could read. Maps, paths, escape routes, plans. His silence was no longer emptiness, it was calculation. There was no hope for freedom, not in the sense of running north. Too many had tried, and their bodies swung from trees as warnings. No, Solomon was not planning escape. He was planning reckoning. The first act came quietly. One evening, When the overseer staggered toward the shacks with his whip loose and his breath sour with rum, Solomon was waiting in the shadows. No one saw what happened, only that the overseer never made it back to the big house. His body was found in the swamp days later, bloated, eyes eaten out by crows. The slaves said nothing. The masters muttered of accidents, of swamp beasts, of misfortune. But among the cabins, in whispers that dared not rise above the crackle of fire, a seed of hope stirred. Yet Solomon did not stop. Each cruelty he witnessed became fuel. Each lash across another's back, each scream that split the night, each tear shed in silence. He carried them all, stored them like kindling in a furnace that now burned with purpose. He was no longer just Solomon the slave. In his silence he was becoming something else. A shadow. A hand of vengeance. A ghost that haunted the oppressors. The others began to notice. Though he spoke little, his presence filled the shacks with a strange new energy. His eyes no longer looked down but straight ahead. His silence was no longer submission, it was promise. And though they did not yet know it, the day was coming when Solomon's storm would break open, and the land that thrived on chains and cruelty would taste fear of its own. The disappearance of the overseer was explained away easily enough. The master spoke of alligators, drunken missteps, and the treachery of swamp water. On plantations, death was common and explanations were convenient. But among the shacks, whispers spread like wildfire. The men and women who had once bowed their heads in silence now lifted them, ever so slightly. For the first time in years they felt something besides fear. They felt possibility. And at the center of those whispers stood Solomon. He said nothing of what he had done. He offered no speeches, no reassurances. Yet the others could see it in his eyes, the calm certainty of a man who had chosen his path. A man who no longer feared death because he had already died once, the day his family was torn from him. The next strike did not come immediately. Weeks passed and life returned to its brutal rhythm. Cotton was picked, backs were whipped, screams filled the night. But beneath that rhythm, an undercurrent stirred. Solomon waited, watching, studying. His chance came during the harvest festival. The Aldrich plantation prided itself on spectacle. Each year, Jeremiah Aldrich invited neighboring planters, merchants, and overseers to feast and drink at his grand hall. The slaves worked twice as hard during these gatherings, forced to prepare food, polish silver, and play music for the entertainment of those who treated them as less than human. Solomon was assigned to the kitchens that evening alongside Celeste. The air was thick with roasted meats and wine, laughter spilling through the halls. But in the back rooms, where slaves moved like shadows, a different tension lingered. Celeste caught Solomon's gaze once. Her eyes, tired but sharp, seemed to ask a question without words. Solomon answered with the faintest nod. That night, she cooked as she always had, her hands steady, her face expressionless. But into one of the wine barrels, Solomon poured a tincture he had been preparing for weeks. It was not poison, not yet. It was paralysis. A compound he had learned to mix from herbs gathered in the swamps, combined with knowledge stolen from overheard lessons in the doctor's house. When the guests toasted, their glasses shining under candlelight, they did not notice Solomon watching from the shadows. They drank deep, laughing louder than before, unaware that their throats were swallowing silence. Minutes later, one by one, their laughter faltered. Forks slipped from hands. Words froze in throats. Their bodies stiffened as though gripped by invisible chains. They remained alive, fully conscious, yet trapped within their own skin. Panic rippled through the hall as some collapsed in their chairs, eyes wide, unable to move. Others slumped onto the tables, locked between life and death. Servants screamed. Guests shouted for doctors. But Solomon stood still, his arms folded, watching them the way they had watched slaves suffer for years, without lifting a hand. That night only 3 men died. The paralysis faded after hours of torment, leaving most shaken but alive. Jeremiah Aldrich raged, blaming Celeste, blaming anyone but himself. He beat the slaves savagely in search of answers, but none spoke. What they did not know was that Solomon had intended it so. It was not the time for mass slaughter. He wanted them to feel fear first, to know the taste of helplessness, to experience what it meant to scream inside their minds while their bodies betrayed them. It was a message, and it was only the beginning. As weeks turned to months, strange deaths began to shadow Charleston. A merchant collapsed mid-conversation, his face locked in a scream no one heard. A judge died in his sleep, his hands clawed against his bedsheets as though he had awakened to a nightmare. A ship captain, strong and healthy, was found dead in his quarters, eyes wide with terror, though not a mark lay on his body. Doctors called it sudden apoplexy, mysterious fever, or the will of God. But among the slaves, the truth was whispered from mouth to mouth. Solomon had begun his work. He moved like a ghost, never leaving trace or suspicion. Sometimes he slipped tinctures into a goblet of wine. Sometimes a powder was stirred into medicine. Sometimes a simple touch, a needle prick unnoticed, was enough. Each target was chosen with precision. Men who had traded families, men who had beaten women, men who had profited from chains and auctions. To the city's elite, it seemed a plague had begun to stalk them. But to the enslaved it was justice. Fear changed the city. Masters who once swaggered through markets with whips dangling at their sides now looked over their shoulders. Men who had never known terror began to lock their doors, refuse food, and dismiss their slaves from serving at their tables. Rumors of curses spread. Some called it God's punishment. Others whispered of rebellion. For the first time in memory, the oppressors felt hunted. And all the while, Solomon moved quietly, calmly, never boasting, never confessing. To outward eyes, he was the same as always, the strong, silent man called Ox. But inside, he kept careful record, writing in a hidden journal where each death was documented with precision. The climax came on a humid summer evening in Charleston. A secret gathering was held at the offices of Henderson and Associates, a firm tied deeply to the slave trade. 6 of the city's most powerful men sat around a polished conference table, drinking, discussing profits, and plotting shipments of human lives. To them it was routine. To Solomon it was opportunity. He had waited for this moment. Waited with the patience of a hunter stalking prey. That night, he slipped into the building with the help of Thomas Grimby, a journalist who had begun to suspect the truth. Grimby was no abolitionist, but he was a man hungry for a story, and Solomon's quiet war fascinated him. He agreed to observe, to record, to bear witness. When the men raised their glasses, Solomon's hand trembled not at all as he poured the final dose into their wine. Within the hour, silence fell. 6 powerful men sat frozen at the table, eyes wide with terror, unable to move, unable even to scream. Their bodies appeared lifeless, yet their minds were trapped in full awareness. And Solomon stood beside them, calm as ever, watching. He did not flee when the constables arrived. He did not struggle when they bound his wrists. He looked each man in the eye and spoke with clarity. "I am not running. Let them come. Let them discover what I've done." That night, Charleston discovered not just a crime but a reckoning. A slave, a man stripped of everything, had turned the very knowledge meant to heal into a weapon of fear. The silent storm had broken, and the city would never be the same. When the city constables burst into the offices of Henderson and Associates, they had expected a drunken brawl, perhaps a fight between rival merchants. Instead, what they found would haunt Charleston for decades. 6 of the city's most prominent men sat around the polished mahogany table, their bodies stiff, eyes wide, mouths frozen in silent horror. To all appearances they were corpses. And yet, their skin still glowed with warmth. Their chests still rose and fell with the faintest of breaths. And standing calmly beside them, his wrists bound without resistance, was Solomon Fairfax. "I did this," he told the chief constable. His voice was steady, neither boastful nor pleading. "And I will tell you how." That night, his confession began. The confession. In the dim light of the constable's office, Solomon spoke with the same calm precision that had marked his every act. He explained the compound he had crafted, an exotic paralytic distilled from herbs, swamp plants, and chemicals gathered during his years assisting Dr. Hathaway. He described its effects: total muscular paralysis, consciousness preserved, a prison built from within one's own body. He spoke of his victims not as men, but as links in a chain that had shackled his people. He named them one by one: Fitzpatrick, Calverton, Dandridge, men of wealth and standing, men whose cruelty had been hidden beneath polished shoes and tailored coats. Each had profited from the buying and selling of flesh. Each had torn families apart, including his own. For nearly 2 years, Charleston's physicians had puzzled over mysterious deaths with no mark of violence, no cause that could be named. Now the riddle was solved. The constables wrote furiously, their pens scratching across the pages, capturing every detail of the confession. And when Solomon was asked why he had chosen this path, his voice hardened into steel. "They took my wife. They took my children. They called it lawful. They called it God's will. But even slaves have limits to what they will endure in silence." The trial begins. News of the arrest spread through Charleston like a storm at sea. Within hours, crowds gathered at the courthouse demanding justice. To the city's elite, the matter was simple: A slave had confessed to multiple murders. Order must be restored. But beneath the surface, something more dangerous stirred. Whispers spread in taverns, markets, and churchyards. If one man could strike fear into Charleston's most powerful, what might hundreds do? Thousands? The authorities moved quickly. Within weeks, Solomon was brought to trial, his fate to be decided by 12 white jurors and a society desperate to protect itself. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Charles Rutledge, wasted no time. He painted Solomon as a monster, a cunning brute who had betrayed the trust of his masters, using stolen knowledge to wreak havoc. "This is not justice," Rutledge thundered. "This is murder. And if we allow it to be excused, we invite chaos into every household in this city." The defense was led by Benjamin Crawford, a court-appointed lawyer who accepted the case with visible reluctance. Everyone knew Crawford could not save his client. But Solomon's calm presence unsettled even him. Crawford chose a daring strategy, not to deny Solomon's guilt, but to expose the system that had birthed it. He spoke of the brutality of the slave auctions, the tearing apart of families, the whip, the chain, the silence forced upon human beings treated as cattle. "Gentlemen of the jury," Crawford said, his voice low but steady, "you see before you not a madman but a father. You see not a monster, but a man driven to the edge of human endurance by a system none of us dare examine too closely. If you condemn him, then condemn also the machine that made him." The courtroom fell silent. Grimby's pen. In the gallery, Thomas Grimby scribbled furiously. The young journalist had risked everything to witness Solomon's acts, and now he risked even more to record the trial. His articles for the Charleston Mercury sent shockwaves through the South. He did not soften the details. He described the paralytic compound, the methodical precision with which Solomon had chosen his targets, the terrifying accounts of those who had survived burial while still alive. Most disturbing of all were the testimonies of the 6 men paralyzed in Henderson's office. They had lived to tell their ordeal, and their words dripped like poison into the public's mind. "I could hear everything," Colonel Harrison Vance told the court. His voice shook as he described the night. "I could feel my body laid out, could hear the doctor pronounce me dead, could hear my wife weeping over me. I wanted to scream, to move, to tell her I still lived, but I was a prisoner inside my own flesh. If Solomon Fairfax wished to teach me terror, he succeeded beyond all measure." When news spread that earlier victims, Fitzpatrick, Calverton, Dandridge, had been buried alive, Charleston erupted in horror. Families demanded exhumations. Graves were opened, revealing scratch marks on coffin lids. The dead had clawed desperately at their wooden prisons, confirming every word of Solomon's journal. The debate. The trial became more than a question of one man's guilt. It became a mirror held up to Charleston's soul. Some saw only a criminal who must hang. "If one slave can do this," plantation owners whispered, "then none of us are safe." Laws were already being drafted to tighten control, to strip away what little access enslaved people had to knowledge or medicine. But others, quietly, dangerously, saw something different. They saw proof that slaves were not docile, not ignorant, not content. They saw intelligence, patience, and above all, rage. Even among the city's white citizens, a few dared to ask questions in hushed tones. Was Solomon's vengeance not born from a crime greater than his own? Was the true monster the man in chains, or the system that forged those chains? The verdict. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. No one in Charleston was surprised. The law demanded order, and order demanded Solomon's death. Yet the swiftness of the decision did little to quiet the unease that rippled through the city. Solomon received the sentence with the same calm that had defined him since the night of his capture. Death by hanging. When asked if he wished to make a final statement, he rose, his chains clinking against the wooden floor. "I was trained to heal," he said. His voice carried through the silent courtroom. "To preserve life, to ease suffering. But when this society destroyed my family and called it lawful, I learned that the same knowledge that heals can also ensure justice. I do not ask for mercy. None was shown to my wife or my children. I ask only that when you condemn me, you remember, I did not create the system that made such revenge necessary." Not a sound stirred when he finished. Even Rutledge, the fiery prosecutor, found no words. The gavel struck, and the trial of Solomon Fairfax was over. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint whistle of the wind pushing through the cracks of the old wooden cabin. Solomon sat in the corner, his back pressed against the wall, his eyes staring at the flickering flame of the oil lamp. Every shadow on the wall seemed alive, dancing and twisting, reminding him of the souls who had suffered before him. He could still hear the faint cries of men and women in chains, echoes of his ancestors that refused to be silenced. Their whispers pressed against his mind, urging him forward. Do not let our suffering be in vain. Do not let them forget. His body was worn, but his spirit burned hotter than ever. Every scar on his skin was a story etched by the whip. Every ache in his bones was a reminder of the years stolen from him. Yet in that suffering something had grown, a fire that could not be extinguished. Solomon was no longer just a man. He was a vessel carrying generations of rage, grief, and justice long denied. The plantation was quiet outside. The overseers, drunk from their nightly indulgence, slept without care, their laughter replaced by snores. It was in that stillness Solomon moved. He rose slowly, steadying himself against the rough wood, and reached for the small blade hidden beneath the loose plank of the floor. It was not sharp, nor was it strong, but in his hand it became a weapon of purpose. He stepped out into the night, the earth cool beneath his bare feet. The moonlight cast a pale glow over the fields, illuminating the endless rows of crops that had cost so many lives. His heart tightened as he walked past them, remembering faces of those who had collapsed under the burning sun, never to rise again. The soil itself seemed to breathe with their ghosts. Solomon's path led him to the overseer's quarters. The man who lived within had been the architect of much of his suffering. The lash, the endless toil, the cruelty that stripped men of their dignity. Solomon paused at the doorway, the wooden handle beneath his palm trembling slightly with the weight of what he was about to do. His breath slowed. In that moment, time seemed to hold still. He pushed the door open. The room reeked of whiskey, and the overseer lay sprawled across the bed, snoring in drunken sleep. For a long moment, Solomon simply stood there, the blade glinting faintly in his hand. The voices of the past rose again, louder now, filling the room. Do it, for us. For the chains. For the graves unmarked. His hand tightened. His body moved. The blade came down. The silence that followed was thicker than before, heavier, as though the very earth had stopped to listen. Solomon did not rejoice, nor did he weep. He simply stood over the still body, his breath ragged, his hands trembling. Justice, once only a dream, had taken its first form. Yet he knew this was only the beginning. Outside, the night carried on as if nothing had happened. The fields swayed gently in the breeze, the stars burned quietly above, indifferent to the blood that now stained Solomon's hands. But he felt no fear. He felt clarity. He understood now that vengeance was not a single act, it was a path. And he was prepared to walk it until the very end. As he left the overseer's quarters, the blade still wet in his hand, Solomon whispered into the darkness, his voice low but steady, "You will remember us. You will all remember." The land itself seemed to shiver in response, and for the first time in his life, Solomon felt that the power no longer belonged to the masters but to him. The night after the overseer's death was unlike any other. The air itself seemed to hum with a strange energy, as though the land recognized that something had changed. Solomon walked through the fields slowly, his blade hidden once more, his face calm but his heart thundering. He knew what he had done could not remain hidden for long. By morning, the plantation would awaken not only to the body of its cruel enforcer but to the truth that fear no longer belonged only to the slaves. The whispers began before the sun rose. Among the cabins, word spread in hurried breaths and trembling voices, "The overseer is dead." At first, many thought it was a rumor, some desperate invention born from exhaustion and wishful thinking. But when the truth was confirmed, the air shifted. For the first time in years, the slaves allowed themselves to imagine a different world. Hope, fragile yet undeniable, sparked in their eyes. Solomon stood before them, not as a leader he had chosen to be, but as one chosen by the weight of their suffering. They looked to him for answers, for direction. Some wept silently, unable to comprehend the enormity of what had happened. Others clenched their fists, the fire of long-suppressed rage awakening in their blood. "Brothers, sisters," Solomon said, his voice steady though his body trembled with exhaustion. "They thought we would bow forever. They thought chains and whips could make us forget who we are. But last night proved the truth. We are not powerless. We are not voiceless. We are alive, and they will hear us." A hush fell over the crowd. The words were not grand, but they carried the force of 1,000 years of silence breaking. Solomon felt the eyes of every man, woman, and child upon him. He saw in their faces the same grief that had lived in him, the same hunger for freedom, the same need for justice. The decision was no longer his alone. The overseer's death had set events into motion that could not be undone. The plantation would demand blood in return, perhaps all of theirs. To remain still was to invite slaughter. To rise was to risk everything, yet for the first time the risk seemed worth it. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Solomon led them into the fields, not to work but to stand together. The owners and their guards, roused by confusion and fear, rode out with guns in hand. Their eyes darted from one slave to the next, searching for signs of guilt, of defiance. But what they found was not fear, it was unity. When the master shouted, demanding answers, none spoke. When he raised his whip, not one flinched. Solomon stepped forward then, his blade hidden at his side, his eyes locked on the man who had stolen everything from him. "No more," he said, his voice carrying across the fields. The standoff held for what felt like an eternity. Then the silence shattered as one voice rose behind Solomon, then another, then dozens more. They did not shout words, they shouted their defiance, their existence. A roar of voices, raw and unstoppable, filled the morning air. The master's whip fell to his side, his confidence faltering. The guards, though armed, hesitated. They had weapons, but the slaves had something greater. The strength of desperation, the will of the oppressed who had nothing left to lose. And in that moment, Solomon knew the war for their souls had begun. The hours after the overseer's death stretched on like an eternity. Solomon did not sleep. He sat on the edge of his bunk, the faint glow of the oil lamp flickering across his scarred face. His mind was restless, filled with whispers of both dread and resolve. What he had done could never be undone. The overseer's blood still lingered on his blade, faint but undeniable, a symbol of justice in his eyes, but also a promise of the storm that was to come. When the first thin light of dawn touched the horizon, the plantation stirred. The fields, usually filled with the muffled sounds of chains dragging and weary feet shuffling, seemed eerily quiet. Men and women stepped from their cabins in silence, their eyes darting toward one another, as though they each carried a secret they were not yet willing to speak aloud. The news had traveled faster than fire. The overseer was dead. Some refused to believe it. They whispered that it was only a rumor, a cruel trick of hope. Others, bolder in their conviction, nodded with grim certainty. They had seen the shadows moving in the night, had heard footsteps too steady to belong to the fearful. And when Solomon stepped into the morning light, his face unreadable, they knew the truth without needing words. He did not stand taller than the rest, nor was he free of the exhaustion that had bent all their backs. But there was something in his eyes, an unshakable flame, that drew them in. Mothers clutched their children closer, young men exchanged glances of nervous excitement, and the elders, those who had endured longer than most, bowed their heads in silent approval. By the time the sun had fully risen, a crowd had gathered around him. Not because Solomon demanded it, but because they had chosen it. They looked to him not as a savior, but as the vessel of their collective rage, grief, and hope. He cleared his throat, his voice rough from lack of sleep, but steady. "Brothers, sisters, they have beaten us, starved us, broken our bones and tried to break our spirit. But we are still here. And last night, we showed them that fear does not only belong to us." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some gasped, realizing he was no longer hiding the truth. He was claiming it. Others nodded slowly, their chests rising with something unfamiliar, courage. Solomon's eyes swept over the sea of faces before him. He saw the deep lines carved by years of toil. He saw children too young to understand yet old enough to feel the weight of chains on their parents' shoulders. He saw men with shoulders bowed but fists clenched, and women whose eyes burned with the fire of those who had lost too much. "They will come for us," he continued, his tone low but resolute. "When they find him, they will demand punishment. They will not stop with me. They will try to make an example of us all. But hear me now." He raised his voice, each word striking like a hammer. "If we bow today, there will be no tomorrow. If we fight, there is a chance for freedom, a chance for justice, a chance to finally say, no more." The silence that followed was suffocating. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then slowly a voice rose from the crowd. A woman, old and frail, her back bent with age. Her voice was cracked but clear, "No more." It was barely more than a whisper, but it spread like a spark in dry grass. Another voice followed. Then another. Soon dozens echoed the words, their voices weaving together in defiance. "No more. No more." Solomon felt the air shift. The hopelessness that had chained them tighter than iron for so long began to weaken. In its place was something dangerous, something powerful, belief. The sound carried across the fields, reaching the ears of the guards and the master who had been roused from their sleep by the commotion. Within minutes, horse hooves thundered against the earth. Armed men appeared, guns slung across their shoulders, their faces twisted with confusion and anger. Behind them rode the master himself, his eyes bloodshot, his whip coiled tightly in his hand. He halted his horse at the edge of the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the mass of slaves who dared to stand idle instead of laboring. "What is this?" he barked. "Back to work. Every last one of you." No one moved. The master's lips curled into a sneer. He raised his whip high, the leather cracking through the air. "You dare defy me? Do you forget who you belong to?" Again no one moved. The whip hung suspended in the air, but it had lost its power. Solomon stepped forward then, his shoulders squared, his blade hidden at his side. He did not shout. He did not need to. His voice carried in the quiet morning. "We belong to no one." The master's eyes widened. For the first time he saw not fear in their eyes but unity. A trembling uncertainty flickered across his face. The guards shifted uneasily in their saddles. They had guns, yes, but they were outnumbered. And what good were weapons if the very people they were meant to control no longer feared death? The tension was unbearable. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Then from the back of the crowd a roar rose, not words but pure defiance. A sound that came from the depths of generations, from graves unmarked and dreams unfulfilled. It was the sound of the oppressed refusing silence. The slaves surged forward, their voices crashing like thunder. The guards raised their rifles instinctively, but their hands shook. The master's whip fell uselessly to his side. And there, beneath the rising sun, on the soil watered with centuries of suffering, the first spark of rebellion was lit. The plantation had always been ruled by silence, broken only by the crack of the whip, the dull thud of tools and soil, and the muffled cries of the weary. But now that silence was shattered. The air trembled with voices raised in defiance, a roar that grew louder, stronger, more unstoppable with each heartbeat. The master sat frozen on his horse, whip still dangling uselessly in his hand. His guards, hardened men who had carried out countless punishments without hesitation, now shifted uneasily. Their rifles were raised, but their arms trembled. For the first time, the power that had seemed unshakable teetered on the edge of collapse. Solomon stood at the front, his face calm yet resolute. He knew what came next: violence, blood, consequences no one could escape. But he also knew there was no turning back. Fear had ruled too long and it had lost its grip. "Stand with me," he said, not shouting, but his words carried like iron in the morning air. "Today we decide if we are cattle, or if we are men and women who deserve to live free." The crowd murmured, fists clenching, backs straightening. The memory of lashes across their skin, of children torn from mothers, of families broken and sold away, each scar became fuel for the fire building inside them. The master found his voice then, a sharp bark meant to cut through their defiance. "Enough. You will all pay for this insolence. You will watch this man hang, and you will learn your place again." He pointed at Solomon, his face twisted with rage. The guards snapped from their hesitation. Rifles rose, barrels glinting in the sun. The crowd flinched but did not scatter. Solomon lifted a hand, steady, unshaken. "If they fire," he said, his voice carrying across the rows of faces, "then let our last breath be spent standing, not kneeling." A hush fell, tense and electric. For one impossible moment, it seemed the world had paused. Then chaos erupted. A stone, hurled from somewhere in the back, struck one of the guards squarely in the head. He cried out, toppling from his saddle. The sudden break was all it took. The slaves surged forward with a collective scream, years of buried anguish unleashed in a single instant. The guards fired wildly, smoke and gunfire filling the air. The sound of bullets tearing through flesh mingled with cries of pain and rage. Yet even as bodies fell, the crowd did not break. They pushed forward, wielding whatever they had: hoes, shovels, fists hardened by decades of labor. Solomon moved with purpose, his blade flashing in the light. He was not reckless, but deliberate, striking only when needed, protecting those who faltered, guiding those who wavered. He had not asked for this role, but it had found him nonetheless. The master's horse reared, panicked by the noise and press of bodies. He struggled to control it, his face a mask of fury and fear. "Kill them!" he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "Kill every last one of them." But the tide had turned. The guards, outnumbered and overwhelmed, faltered beneath the sheer weight of desperation. One was dragged from his horse and beaten until he no longer moved. Another dropped his rifle and fled, only to be caught before he reached the edge of the fields. The master, seeing the balance shift, pulled his pistol from his coat. His eyes locked on Solomon. With a roar of hatred, he aimed and fired. The shot rang out, sharp and final. Solomon staggered, the world spinning around him. For a moment, everything slowed, the cries, the chaos, the sunlight glinting on smoke-filled air. He looked down, seeing the blood spreading across his shirt. A gasp rippled through the crowd. For a heartbeat, fear threatened to return. The master sneered, believing victory was his. But then Solomon straightened. The wound burned, his body screamed in protest, but his will was stronger. He raised his blade, his voice cutting through the noise like thunder. "Is this the man you fear?" he bellowed, pointing at the trembling figure atop the horse. "He bleeds like any other. He dies like any other." The crowd roared in response. With renewed fury they surged toward the master. His pistol clicked empty as he fired again and again, desperation overtaking arrogance. Hands dragged him from his saddle, pulling him into the mass of bodies. His screams were swallowed by the roar of rebellion. The fields burned with the fury of the oppressed. Flames were lit, cabins set alight, stores of grain and tools cast into the blaze. It was destruction, but also liberation, a purging of everything that had bound them in silence. By nightfall, the plantation was no longer the master's. The house stood ransacked, its fine furniture broken, its portraits torn from the walls. The overseer's quarters were nothing but ash. The air smelled of smoke, blood, and freedom, sharp, bitter, intoxicating. Solomon sat at the edge of the fields, his shirt soaked in blood, his body weary beyond words. Around him, the survivors gathered. Some wept, clutching loved ones who had not made it. Others sat in stunned silence, their minds struggling to grasp what they had done. They were free, or at least freer than they had ever been. But freedom, they knew, was fragile. The world beyond these fields would not welcome them. Armies would be raised. Posses would come. Retaliation would be swift and merciless. Solomon's hand trembled as he pressed it to his wound. He lifted his gaze to the faces around him, men, women, and children looking to him once more. Not as a slave, not even as a man of vengeance, but as a leader. "We have struck a blow," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "But this is only the beginning. They will come for us. We must be ready." A hush settled, heavy with both fear and resolve. No one doubted him. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. The fire in the fields was not just in the soil or the sky, it was in their hearts now, burning brighter than chains could ever bind. That night, as the stars stretched endless above them, the slaves of Fairfax Plantation became fugitives, rebels, and symbols of something greater than themselves. Their rebellion was no longer a whisper in the dark. It was a fire that could not be hidden. And at its center stood Solomon, bleeding, unbowed, and unwilling to surrender. The plantation had always been ruled by silence, broken only by the crack of the whip, the dull thud of tools and soil, and the muffled cries of the weary. But now that silence was shattered. The air trembled with voices raised in defiance, a roar that grew louder, stronger, more unstoppable with each heartbeat. The master sat frozen on his horse, whip still dangling uselessly in his hand. His guards, hardened men who had carried out countless punishments without hesitation, now shifted uneasily. Their rifles were raised, but their arms trembled. For the first time, the power that had seemed unshakable teetered on the edge of collapse. Solomon stood at the front, his face calm yet resolute. He knew what came next: violence, blood, consequences no one could escape. But he also knew there was no turning back. Fear had ruled too long and it had lost its grip. "Stand with me," he said, not shouting, but his words carried like iron in the morning air. "Today we decide if we are cattle, or if we are men and women who deserve to live free." The crowd murmured, fists clenching, backs straightening. The memory of lashes across their skin, of children torn from mothers, of families broken and sold away, each scar became fuel for the fire building inside them. The master found his voice then, a sharp bark meant to cut through their defiance. "Enough. You will all pay for this insolence. You will watch this man hang, and you will learn your place again." He pointed at Solomon, his face twisted with rage. The guards snapped from their hesitation. Rifles rose, barrels glinting in the sun. The crowd flinched but did not scatter. Solomon lifted a hand, steady, unshaken. "If they fire," he said, his voice carrying across the rows of faces, "then let our last breath be spent standing, not kneeling." A hush fell, tense and electric. For one impossible moment, it seemed the world had paused. Then chaos erupted. A stone, hurled from somewhere in the back, struck one of the guards squarely in the head. He cried out, toppling from his saddle. The sudden break was all it took. The The slaves surged forward with a collective scream, years of buried anguish unleashed in a single instant. The guards fired wildly, smoke and gunfire filling the air. The sound of bullets tearing through flesh mingled with cries of pain and rage. Yet even as bodies fell, the crowd did not break. They pushed forward, wielding whatever they had: hoes, shovels, fists hardened by decades of labor. Solomon moved with purpose, his blade flashing in the light. He was not reckless, but deliberate, striking only when needed, protecting those who faltered, guiding those who wavered. He had not asked for this role, but it had found him nonetheless. The master's horse reared, panicked by the noise and press of bodies. He struggled to control it, his face a mask of fury and fear. "Kill them!" he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "Kill every last one of them." But the tide had turned. The guards, outnumbered and overwhelmed, faltered beneath the sheer weight of desperation. One was dragged from his horse and beaten until he no longer moved. Another dropped his rifle and fled, only to be caught before he reached the edge of the fields. The master, seeing the balance shift, pulled his pistol from his coat. His eyes locked on Solomon. With a roar of hatred, he aimed and fired. The shot rang out, sharp and final. Solomon staggered, the world spinning around him. For a moment, everything slowed. The cries, the chaos, the sunlight glinting on smoke-filled air. He looked down, seeing the blood spreading across his shirt. A gasp rippled through the crowd. For a heartbeat, fear threatened to return. The master sneered, believing victory was his. But then Solomon straightened. The wound burned, his body screamed in protest, but his will was stronger. He raised his blade, his voice cutting through the noise like thunder. "Is this the man you fear?" he bellowed, pointing at the trembling figure atop the horse. "He bleeds like any other. He dies like any other." The crowd roared in response. With renewed fury they surged toward the master. His pistol clicked empty as he fired again and again, desperation overtaking arrogance. Hands dragged him from his saddle, pulling him into the mass of bodies. His screams were swallowed by the roar of rebellion. The fields burned with the fury of the oppressed. Flames were lit, cabins set alight, stores of grain and tools cast into the blaze. It was destruction, but also liberation, a purging of everything that had bound them in silence. By nightfall, the plantation was no longer the master's. The house stood ransacked, its fine furniture broken, its portraits torn from the walls. The overseer's quarters were nothing but ash. The air smelled of smoke, blood, and freedom, sharp, bitter, intoxicating. Solomon sat at the edge of the fields, his shirt soaked in blood, his body weary beyond words. Around him, the survivors gathered. Some wept, clutching loved ones who had not made it. Others sat in stunned silence, their minds struggling to grasp what they had done. They were free, or at least freer than they had ever been. But freedom, they knew, was fragile. The world beyond these fields would not welcome them. Armies would be raised. Posses would come. Retaliation would be swift and merciless. Solomon's hand trembled as he pressed it to his wound. He lifted his gaze to the faces around him, men, women, and children looking to him once more. Not as a slave, not even as a man of vengeance, but as a leader. "We have struck a blow," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "But this is only the beginning. They will come for us. We must be ready." A hush settled, heavy with both fear and resolve. No one doubted him. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. The fire in the fields was not just in the soil or the sky, it was in their hearts now, burning brighter than chains could ever bind. That night, as the stars stretched endless above them, the slaves of Fairfax Plantation became fugitives, rebels, and symbols of something greater than themselves. Their rebellion was no longer a whisper in the dark. It was a fire that could not be hidden. And at its center stood Solomon, bleeding, unbowed, and unwilling to surrender.